take up H.R. 4241, the Resolution Trust Corporation financing bill. Up next, from the Bronx, New York, we bring you live coverage of a Democratic presidential candidates debate. You'll see Jerry Brown and Governor Bill Clinton, the two remaining major Democratic presidential candidates, discuss national politics and issues of importance in New York. Voters in the Empire State go to the polls next Tuesday. The debate, which is courtesy of Bronx Community Cable Programming Corporation, is titled The Debate for Urban America. The debate began at 7 p.m. We now join it in progress.
Public education in America has been in crisis for more than a decade. Nationwide, in 1990, almost 18% of students between 18 and 24 didn't graduate from high school. According to the last census, 23% of all African Americans in this same age group did not have a high school diploma. And for Hispanic students, the rate was much worse. 46% had not graduated from high school. In higher education, in the last 10 years, students have had to rely more on loans than grants, while tuition keeps rising. Federal funding for the nation's schools is down significantly in some areas, and the use of the property tax to fund schools is under attack as unequal and unfair. Local school districts say the federal government should provide more funding.
Thank you, Dr. Fernandez. And now Sam Roberts of the New York Times will ask our first question. Sam?
Governor Clinton, we know that you favor more funding for Head Start, national standards for education, and a national apprenticeship program to link college-bound students with local schools and businesses. But what about all the kids who don't graduate, who drop out, become virtually unemployable? And how would you help that disproportionate number of urban, Black, Hispanic students who are not even finishing high school? And how would you pay for the program that you propose?
I do propose to help those people through the establishment of opportunity centers throughout the country, particularly in areas of high dropout, places where people who drop out of school can come out and come back and get basic education and their high school equivalency. Here in New York, I've been in some of the adult education centers, including one in the Harlem Public Library, where there is a waiting list as long as the number of people who are in the program. What I propose to do is to adopt a national program to give everybody who does not have a high school diploma the chance to get one in the workplace or in an adult education center in the next 5 years, and to do it within the context of the funding that I've outlined from the cuts in defense and control of health care costs. We need to do that for everybody who will come back to school.
Governor Brown.
Look, the big issue here is despair, neighborhoods with crack, crime, gang violence, getting worse by the day. It's horrible. And the political establishment just sits there, raises their pay, bounces their checks, and carries on as though their discussions have any impact on anybody. What is required is a commitment to a living family wage, a full employment economy, and cut the military budget in half. Now, within that overall context to income security, which is the absolute response needed, there are some particular things. Scholarships instead of loans, work study emphasis so people without the income can go to college, and also to assist low-wealth school districts with direct federal funding. Also, there's a program that I started in California, the Employment Training Panel, whereby you take money from unemployment insurance and devote a certain amount of it to training those who are in danger of being unemployed. All of that will help, but the overall issue is the commitment, not there.
Follow-up from Sam.
A follow-up. While New York has been debating multicultural education as a controversial issue, in 1987, I believe Arkansas made English the official state language. What was that message intended to convey, and should that be enacted on a national basis as well?
No, the bill that was introduced in our legislature was just a one-line bill. And I said that I would veto it, even though it had veto-proof majorities in both houses behind it, unless we explicitly exempted bilingual education which we did in the bill. And at the time that the bill passed, that was the only potential impact it could have had in our state for the relatively small Hispanic minority. And so I made it clear then, and I will reaffirm now, I support the aims of bilingual education and what is called the English Plus movement, not the English Only movement.
And Governor Brown?
During my governorship in California, we had the foremost programs in bilingual, bicultural education. We have a population, of course, 25% Hispanic Latino Americans, and we respond to that with programs that are culturally relevant. More importantly, I get back to the issue, there must be the opportunity to receive the training, the work, and the self-esteem and the hope. And that only comes when those people at the top get the message.
We go now to Roz Abrams.
We are here tonight at Lehman College, a prominent member of the City University educational system. An awful lot of the kids who attend school here work full-time and they work part-time jobs just to make the tuition. They live at home. They make a lot of sacrifices to go to school here. And yet, every year, they face the possibility of increased tuition because more and more federal monies keep being deducted. Governor Brown, will you increase federal aid to state and local college systems to help keep tuitions affordable?
Yes, I will. I believe when I went to the University of California, it cost $120 a semester. Today, that would be like $300 or $400 a semester, and that is a thing of the past. We have to make the financial barriers disappear for those who are qualified and can profit from higher education. My commitment is for more work study, more scholarship, and reduce the reliance on loans. I think it's a disaster that we're turning millions of American students into lifelong debtors where they have to save not for their children's education, but to pay back their own.
Please. Thank you, Governor Brown.
Yeah, I would like to give a kind of a three-part answer to your question. First of all, it is absolutely imperative that we restore the levels of federal funding and aid to student aid that existed 10 or 11 years ago. They've been cut back mercilessly. They've not kept up with inflation, and it is a scandal. We do not have enough federal aid. Secondly, I think we have to understand that the student loan program works in a very onerous way, and I propose to abolish it and to replace it with a national trust fund out of which any American could borrow the money to go to college with the assurance that they would pay it back as a small percentage of their income, so in accord with their ability to pay, or they could pay it all off in 2 years by doing 2 years of service to our country here at home as a teacher, a police officer, working in a drug program, or at some other needed public service area.
Do you have a follow-up, Roz?
In terms of the buildings on campuses, the physical plants, we have a lot of classrooms that are in disrepair. Science labs have to maintain state-of-the-art equipment. Our libraries have to be maintained. Where's the money going to come from to do that, to keep our institutions of higher learning the best in the world?
It's going to come from a total reordering of our nation's priorities. For 50 years, we've been fighting the Cold War, containing communism, spending $12 trillion. It is now supremely evident that the challenge is right here. It's the devastation in cities, it's the underinvestment in our human talent, and the way around that is cut the military budget in half, accomplish that goal in 5 years, and rechannel the money into infrastructure, universities, research, educational technology, and start taking that research budget, which has been as high as 80% military, and move it in a civilian research and development direction, the funding of which will show up in the universities of this country.
Governor Clinton.
We should at least double the civilian research and development budget of this country in the next 4 years. Japan is a country with half our population with twice the R&D budget for commercial research and development. We have to do that. I also think, frankly, we need an effort on the part of the national government to analyze the increasing cost of a college education. It's the only thing that's gone up by more than health care in the last 3 or 4 years. And I think we need to do what we can to help that. And finally, we need to control health care costs, bring them within line to inflation. Then states will also be able to put more money into education.
Thank you, gentlemen. Another question on education now from Jim Sleeper.
For Governor Clinton, in East Harlem, 19 public schools have been turned into 50 smaller, more varied ones, and parents choose freely among them. The results are so good that middle-class white parents are busing their kids into East Harlem, and other districts are following suit. But replicating that on a national level would cost a lot of money, and in the meantime, I'd like to know what you would say to the thousands of parents watching this program and here whose kids are going to private and parochial schools and who want help in the form of federal vouchers for aid in that way.
I'm opposed to federal vouchers. I'm very strongly in favor of public school choice plans like the one in East Harlem. My state was the second state after Minnesota to adopt a statewide public school choice plan. But we can't afford vouchers. It would divert public funds from public schools at a time when America's spending on kindergarten through 12th grade is below that of many of our competitors as a percentage of our income. So I simply don't favor the private voucher system, nor do I agree that it's going to be much more costly to implement public school choice programs around the country. Every state should be doing it right now, and they can be doing it. We're going to put more money in education, but we can do with the resources we have more if we have statewide public school choice.
I believe we should make federal funds available for local school districts and cut out a lot of the categorical restraints that then force bureaucracies to grow and force these large consolidated school districts. What is really powerful is to have a small, intimate school setting, particularly in the early grades, so that each child has a recognition and an identity, very special, esteemed, and acknowledged. And the reason why that doesn't happen is not because small schools aren't more efficient, it's just the elaboration of rules and bureaucracy that force the larger and larger integration of public schools. And I think we should be making an option available to trust the local school districts, because where it happens is not the president, he's not the superintendent, not even the principal, it's in the classroom. And the more funds we can make available to that with the least strings available, the better education is going to be.
Thank you, Governors. To introduce our next topic, we go to Bronx Borough President Fernando Ferrer.
The greatest threats to the very lifeblood of cities throughout America are crimes and drugs. There can be no stability in our neighborhoods, safety in our schools, or order on our streets as long as there is crime, or for that matter, the fear of crime. Drugs are indisputably at the center of violent crime, and violent crime has been made worse by the spiraling increase in illegal weapons, claiming innocent victims like New York City Auxiliary Police Officer Armando Rosario. The Brady Bill would institute a waiting period for the purchase of handguns. But does the Brady Bill go far enough in getting deadly weapons off the streets? Let's begin our discussion on crime and drugs, scourges that are tearing our cities apart.
And to do that, we direct a question now to Governor Brown. Governor Brown, we already know that both of you gentlemen support the Brady Bill, but what about illegally purchased guns? They're responsible for a great many, most I should say, of the murders in the big city that we live in. How would you tackle the problem of ridding the streets of our city and of Los Angeles and other cities of the illegal guns that end up so very often in the hands of young children in schools?
One thing you can do is you can put a limit to this suggestion of having a moratorium on the sale of guns. Try that and see if it'll put a stop to it. I signed a waiting bill requiring a 15-day waiting period. I signed a bill as governor requiring a mandatory prison sentence for anyone who uses a gun in the commission of a crime. But let's face it, guns, crime, crack, they're all the function of mounting inequality, despair, and degradation that can only be stopped when we galvanize the moral force that will rededicate us to the investment in each and every family, so there will be an adequate income security. And that has to be a job. It has to require the looking from far away, right here at home, where the real challenge is. And I think all these issues resolve themselves to that one issue of creating the opportunity for every family.
Governor Clinton.
I think you should pass the Brady Bill, and then I think there should be a nationwide attempt to engage the young people of our country in these massive gun buyback programs. I think that incentives should be offered. I think that there should be a challenge. I also think we should stiffen the security around our schools and start making even more stringent efforts to collect dangerous guns when they're in the possession of young people. This is not an easy answer, but it's a very difficult problem. Finally, I think that you can't blame the national culture on everything. I think we're going to have to change a lot of this neighborhood by neighborhood, school by school, family by family. It's going to take a lot of concerned and committed adults working on this effort.
Follow up to Governor Brown and, of course, to Governor Clinton, too. We in New York City have a buyback program that we attempt to buy back guns, and it works one day and fails the next, and overall it has to be said to be not very successful. Governor Brown, in concept, does the idea work?
It doesn't seem to have worked. I mean, it's a nice thing to try, but again, if you grow up in a neighborhood and your father's out of work and most of the people in the block are too, and the greatest self-esteem comes from being in a gang, and the only challenge to your manhood is using a gun or getting in a gang fight, you have produced an impossible social pathology, and that is what has to be gotten at. Sure, we want people to be responsible, but I'd like to see the people who lead this country acting more responsibly and stop just taking care of themselves and wake up and just walk the streets of this city and this nation till they get the message that here is the battle for the future of America.
Governor Clinton, short of moral suasion, would any kind of program work?
I agree that the gun buyback program is going to be of limited utility. It will work more as you get the Brady Bill in place and you enforce it. But there's so much more that has to be done. There are in this nation proven strategies of turning young people who are involved in gangs and involved with weapons back to a more constructive life. But unfortunately, there's no easy way to do it. You have to do it gang by gang, school by school, block by block, person by person. It's going to require a lot of person power and a lot of reconnecting of children whose lives have been severed to the future that we want them to live.
Sam Roberts.
Drug abuse, as both of you know, affects every aspect of life in New York, from health care to crime. And besides a federal role in either paying for or providing treatment on demand, how would you contain the sources of supply? And if boycotting Iraq or Libya to deter their exportation of military aggression or terrorism seems justified, is a Colombian coffee boycott or a limit on immigration from certain countries in South America equally justified to discourage their exportation of drugs?
I don't think
this is to Governor Clinton.
I think the problem with that is that even those countries which try to contain the illegal drugs on their own are having limited success. And we've had many good people in the government of Colombia actually be killed for their efforts to try to contain the export of drugs. What I think we need to do is to beef up the traditional sources of restraint, the Coast Guard, the Border Patrols, the Customs Service. We need to become much better at monitoring the flights into this country. And then we need to work much more closely with those governments that are making a good faith effort. I wouldn't be opposed to taking action against a government that obviously was not trying, but those which are, we have to try to deal with. You can't get out of the fact that with 5% of the world's population, we're consuming 50% of the world's drugs. Most of the problem is here at home.
Governor Brown.
Well, we got a $10 billion drug war. Mr. Noriega, who was fronting for the Colombian cartel, was getting money from the federal government, the CIA, because he was helping with the war against the people in Nicaragua. So I don't think the administration has been very straight in its commitment to really eradicating drugs. And the way you eradicate it is to take away the rationale and the reason for drug dependency. And I'll come back to this over and over again. There is a clear way in which we can reduce drug dependency, and that is to give every child the rich opportunity of growing up in a family where there's income security. And a nation of $6 trillion can do that if its leadership will just stand up and do the right thing.
Follow up from Sam Roberts, please.
As you both know, crime and drugs go hand in hand, and I'd like to return to guns for one moment. Would either of you ban the manufacture of handguns and assault weapons, as well as imposing a waiting period or certain other controls? Governor Clinton?
I would support a ban on assault weapons. I'm not in a position to say that I would favor a ban on the manufacture of handguns. I think there are a lot of other things that we need to be looking at. I agree, by the way, with what Governor Brown said. I think we ought to make it clear that we will not be doing business in a Democratic administration with drug dealers and talking out of both sides of our mouths about this issue the way the previous two administrations have done.
And Governor Brown, on manufacture of guns?
Yeah, somebody, back in 1982, there was an initiative in California to put a cap on the number of guns. Just say handguns. That's enough. And then register them and leave that as the total outside limit. The other day, somebody asked me, what about a 5-year moratorium? Not a bad idea. Let's try it. Let's try it. And then you would have the number that is there, and people would register them, and you could exchange them, but you wouldn't allow the continued production and see if it'll work. I personally do not think that's going to get at the root, which is the inequality, the despair, and the utter hopelessness that so many of our young people are growing up in.
Just by way of follow-up, there are 200 million guns out there now, illegal guns, that wouldn't be covered by the Brady Bill. You could pass some registration bill and require people to come in, but I mean, you're going to have to change the underlying culture. You can't do it in the way you're suggesting, not with 200 million guns out there right now, I don't think.
Thank you, gentlemen. Roz Abrams.
I want to return to children for just a moment. Governor Brown, in this country, there is the perception that, let's say, if I had a son and he were arrested, he would be treated differently than, say, if Jim's son were arrested. There is the real fear that perhaps my child might not even survive an encounter with police. Governor Brown, if you are elected, what specifically are you going to do to make sure that both of our children receive equal protection under the law?
Well, first of all, I'm going to stop appointing right-wing justices so that we can adhere to... So we can adhere to the Constitution. The erosion of civil liberties has been incredible and very dangerous. The search and seizure, the coerced confession, the erosion of the right of habeas corpus. Secondly, I believe we really need to do something very concrete in terms of immediate jobs. Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps for millions of people. I would start that as one of the first acts of my presidency. We have to make that happen. And then finally, you have to make sure that the police are subject to the same rules of fairness and treating people right, subject to liability laws and review as any other operative of government.
Governor Clinton.
As president, I would recognize, first of all, that 99% of all the contacts between children without regard to race and law enforcement are with state and local law enforcement officials. I would support more resources to those officials to create community policing systems. I would support appropriate civilian oversight of police forces to make sure there was some redress when there were examples of discrimination. And I would appoint judges to the bench who would be very, very strong in opposing discrimination of any kind. Those are the things that a president could do besides speaking out for equal treatment.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's go back now to Bronx Borough President Ferrer to introduce our next topic.
There is no better illustration of the changing federal role and its impact on cities than housing. From the last decade, publicly assisted housing has been cut by 80%. Last year, for the first time in over half a century, not a single unit of public housing was built in New York by the federal government. In New York City, over 200,000 families are waiting for public housing. 100,000 are on the streets, homeless. Another 130,000 live illegally with friends and family as part of the so-called hidden homeless. By abandoning the cities, yet demanding more of our tax dollars, the federal government has turned a cold shoulder to the American dream. Let's begin our discussion on how we can get the federal government back into the business of building housing.
Thank you, President Ferrer. And to begin that discussion, we turn to a question from Jim Sleeper for Governor Clinton.
Some say that the homelessness that President Ferrer just referred to is caused by mental illness or addiction. But the fact is, as he suggested, homelessness here soared during the 80s as direct federal low-income housing support plummeted $16 billion in New York alone. Now, you have touted nonprofit ownership, better federal mortgage insurance, earned income tax credits, but that would still leave, it seems to me, a big gap between what many people earn and what it costs to maintain decent housing. Don't you think, Governor, that it's unfair for the feds to give, say, income tax deductions for mortgages on second and third homes when these people can't afford first homes or apartments because of the steep cuts in direct federal aid?
Absolutely, I do. The average person is waiting longer and longer to buy a home. More and more people who are working poor cannot get into homes. The homeless problem is the direct result not only of social problems in our country and profound human dislocation, but of national neglect. And a part of my program to reinvest in our infrastructure would also include direct investment in federal housing programs for those who can find shelter in no other way. I perfectly agree with you. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have more of these other innovations which are better for the working poor, but for those who have no resources, you must have a direct investment. I think most Americans are embarrassed, ashamed, and ready for something to be done about homelessness.
Governor Brown.
I believe that the federal commitment to housing should be reestablished, reinvigorated, and to the extent feasible, allow local discretion. We don't want to have everything decided in Washington. And there are now in the cities of this country representatives that are really in tune and in touch with those needs that have been neglected these last 10 years. So yes, take the mayor's conference. There's a 7-point program of approximately $30 billion that would jumpstart the economy, create the jobs, and a good piece of this is for housing assistance. And I would do that, but in the context of encouraging a maximum local participation.
Well, one of the unique local things about New York, and this does differ somewhat from other cities, is we have a massive public housing authority that, with some exceptions, has been fairly well run. It hasn't had the protracted scandals and the abandonment of units that other places have, but it is starved for the direct federal kinds of capital that it used to get. Do you really think, either of you, that you can come up with the kinds of money that are needed to make a system like that work?
Well, not in the present way this economy is functioning, and one of the reasons I propose this tax proposal of mine is to stimulate the jobs in the economy so we can generate the necessary new wealth. And unless we find a savings and productivity level higher, we're going to constantly be squeezed one priority against the other. But, you know, there are a lot of houses that just need to be rehabilitated. It's one thing to get the money to rehab them, but it's quite another to generate the income every month to allow the families to pay for them. And that gets back to the essential problem that tens of millions of Americans have no way to earn a decent enough income to support themselves and their family. That is the moral imperative of our time.
Governor Clinton.
I believe, of course, we can restore funding levels to the 1980 levels. They've been cut over 11 years. We can't do it in 1 year. We'll have to build it up over the next 4 years. But of course we can. It is a question of will, of conviction, of priorities, and understanding where our own self-interest lies. This is very much in the interest of the American people to have a big, stable stock of affordable housing.
Governor Brown, homelessness and unemployment run always, it seems, hand in hand. Wherever you find heavy unemployment, you are very likely to find a large number of homeless people. But the homeless and the unemployed are concentrated normally and generally in the central cities. Increasingly, at the same time, the jobs are moving to the suburbs. So we ask if the federal government should mandate that suburban areas build low-income housing and shelters for the homeless so that people who need the jobs can be housed and live where the jobs are. Governor Brown.
Well, I support the creation of enterprise zones where the federal government will give a very generous tax break for 10 years for the establishment of business in those areas of high unemployment and high public dependency. That is the real answer if we want to integrate people into the private sector. I don't know how much you can spread people around when you have millions right in the cities that need the work. Secondly, if we allow the welfare check to be a welfare voucher that can be turned into an employer and then allow for the food stamps and the Medicaid to continue, but remove it at the rate of 20% a year for 5 years, you can integrate people who are not working into the private sector, and you can encourage business to take the kind of risks and make the investment with the generous tax break. That's what I think the enterprise zone will do.
Governor Clinton.
I agree that there is a limit to how much you can move people from where they live someplace else for jobs. They will migrate anyway if the jobs are there. I think it's far more important to have an economic development and an empowerment strategy for the inner cities. I don't think an enterprise zone tax credit is a bad idea, but it's not enough. You're going to have banks that really loan money to the neighbors and the friends in the areas. A national network of community development banks modeled on the very successful South Shore Bank in Chicago, and there's one in New York now being established. You're also going to have other economic initiatives designed to reward the working poor through tax credits or that lift them above the poverty line. We can make living affordable and successful in our cities if we have an empowerment and a development strategy.
Follow up to Governor Brown, please. You know the expression NIMBY, everything's wonderful, but don't build low-income housing and homeless shelters in my backyard. NIMBY, not in my backyard. How would you convince the people who live in suburban areas that ultimately the establishment of, whether you call it enterprise zones or homeless shelters and low-income housing, are good for the suburbs because they are good for the cities, if they are good for the cities?
Well, you see, what you have here is people who don't have real jobs, don't have adequate income to support themselves and their family, and now government has to come around and make up for it with some kind of special discounted housing program. What I'm talking about is a total reversal of policy whereby, as a moral imperative, this country commits itself to a living family wage. We can put people to work in retrofitting buildings, in new energy technologies, and building high-speed trains, and child care, and fully funding Head Start. There is plenty of work to do, and if we would stop trying to police the world and take care of ourselves, we can put those people to work, and I'm sure every neighborhood likes fully earning, stable, productive citizens.
Governor Clinton.
I agree that we can put a lot of people to work, but I don't think we should avoid the tough issue. The tough issue is, should the President of the United States ask the American people wherever they live to make sure there's affordable housing for people of all incomes and to take care of the problems of this society? Yes, I think we should. And I think that we can do that if we got a different public ethic in this country. We lived by the politics of selfishness in the 80s. In the 90s, we're going to have to say we're all in this together, everybody counts, and everyone's going to have to sacrifice, reach out, and do something so we can move forward together.
Now to introduce our next topic. Thank you. To introduce our next topic, we turn to the president of Lehman College, Ricardo Fernandez.
The nation's economy has been in recession for nearly 2 years. And for many people, that has translated into unemployment. Nationally, the unemployment rate is 7.3%. In New York City, it's 11%. It's the highest it's been in 16 years. Between December of '91 and February of '92, New York City lost 100,000 jobs, most of them permanently. And the city's welfare rolls have increased to nearly 1 million people. Half of those are children. The states have had to assume increasing costs, which has put a tremendous strain on their budgets.
And to address this topic, we turn from Dr. Fernandez to Sam Roberts and the first question.
Governor Clinton, earlier this year, Vice President Quayle said that New York exemplified the failure of the welfare state. You've called for people on welfare to take more responsibility. Well, there's a waiver application pending from New Jersey. And would you, as president, grant that waiver to let the state end increased benefits for women who have more children while they're on welfare? Or do you disagree that public assistance recipients, just like other working people, must consider their finances before having more children?
I believe that the president should support the states that are trying to make good faith efforts to experiment in how to move people from welfare to work. I don't agree that the New Jersey approach is the best approach to take. The best approach to take is to empower people on welfare before requiring them to take responsibility. What Dan Quayle did here in New York, where people are trying innovative approaches to moving people from welfare to work, and innovative approaches to housing and other things, was an abomination. That administration has done nothing to try to make welfare reform work. Well, here's what I would do. I would set up a system in which we invest more in education and training, in child care, and in medical coverage. Then I would require people who can work to do so. And I would encourage innovation among the states. But I think that for this administration to talk about welfare reform is a disgrace. They've done nothing to help us do it.
Governor Brown.
Again, all this welfare reform is after the horse is out of the barn. You have in Harlem, you have 55% of the people who have given up looking for work because there is no work, and of those who are still in the workforce, 18% are out of work. And yet you're allowing multinational companies that call themselves American corporations moving their jobs to Mexico and Indonesia and everywhere else. We need a strategy of reinvestment right here. And the President of the United States has to make it very clear that you don't save any money by closing down a job in New York City and going to Mexico because you're paying $2 less when you leave devastation at home. It's about an economic goal of energy efficiency, transportation, infrastructure, housing, national health care, putting people to work in doing the unfulfilled agenda of a civilized nation.
If either of you were president, though, would you grant that waiver that New Jersey has requested? Governor Clinton?
I would probably grant the waiver and let them experiment with it. But let me say that it is what you want to do is to empower people to take over their own lives. It is simply not true. Even here in New York and throughout this country, 20 to 25% of the people on welfare have been there for years. And most of them would change if they were educated, if they were given training, if they were given the hope of a job. You do have to have a new economic policy, but you also have to recognize we've done a terrible amount of damage to people by letting them get in this fix, and we have to help them work their way out of it.
As you know, in this campaign, I stay in private residences, not in hotels, and I stayed at a shelter for single mothers and their kids, and I had an opportunity to spend several hours talking to women with 4 and 5 kids, and in a shelter where the rooms are no bigger than a broom closet. And across the street, there's empty buildings with empty apartments. Now, unless we can put the two together and create employment, I think we have to take the responsibility. And I'm not going to try to start interfering with such an intimate decision as when someone has a child or not. I don't think that's the right thing to do, and it allows us to palliate our conscience when we're not committing this nation to the full employment, living family wage economy that I think is absolutely required by distributive justice.
So you would not grant that waiver?
I wouldn't grant the waiver, no. I wouldn't.
Could I just interject one fact, though?
Shortly.
The average welfare family has just a little over 2 people. This is, we're firing the gun at the wrong target. The target is all these people. The target is all these people who have no education, no skills, no hope, who have been left on inadequate life supports when they should have been empowered to take control of their own lives. If you talk to people on welfare, almost 100% of them would gladly live in another way. It is not a good way to live. We have to give them a chance to do something else.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Roz Abrams now with a question.
Governor Brown, what would you do to create new permanent urban industries, creating new permanent urban industries to replace the hundreds of thousands of jobs that have been lost over the past decade? And I'm not talking about artificially propping up inner cities with short-term programs, be they enterprise zones or short-term road building, and when it's done, the jobs are gone. I'm talking about new, long-term urban industries that will carry workers, if they so choose, on into retirement.
Well, you just picked yourself, that's a pretty big order here.
But you want to be president?
Yeah, you said you want to be president. I mean, the fact is that people have been fleeing the cities to get non-union work in the South and then cheap wages in foreign countries. So how do you turn that around? It's going to take a kind of commitment that we don't have. I'll tell you what we have to see. We have to have an opportunity for trade unions to have labor law reform so they get more clout, that the president mobilizes the public investment funds, which are the deferred wages of working people, and pushes those investment to the cities where the wages were earned in the first place, and where we extend stock ownership so there's more ownership by the people working, and they're going to protect those industries from leaving because it's their community and their families that are at stake. And I also think we need an intelligent tax code that will encourage saving and investment instead of this ball and chain that we have around the economy now.
Governor Clinton, you want to be president too.
Tax code.
Well, for one thing, I hope we get a chance to debate Jerry's tax, because I think I agree with the New York Daily News columnist who said it was the biggest ripoff of working people in the history of American politics, and it's a terrible idea. But let me say that.
Well, if we do debate it, I'll have a rejoinder.
Let me say that what you said is you said a couple of things that are inconsistent. Changing the tax code so that there is more incentive to invest in the jobs we have here and to expand the job base, and less incentive to move jobs overseas, is not short-term, that's long-term. We also have to recognize that urban areas were built on manufacturing jobs, and even if we can rebuild industry, most people will work in non-manufacturing jobs. When the manufacturing base left, there was no infrastructure to develop the new job generators in America, small business. That's why you need a network of development banks that make loans to people in their neighborhoods, small business incubators, and support and training programs for people to make their jobs and their livelihoods in non-manufacturing as well as manufacturing areas. That can be done nationwide. The markets are there because the people live there.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Dr. Fernandez now will introduce our final topic of the evening.
Our final topic tonight is health care. More than 35 million Americans have no health care insurance. In New York City, an estimated 1.5 million people are uninsured. Many of these people are persons with AIDS. New York City has the most people with AIDS of any city in the country, more than 37,000 cases. And that's causing enormous pressure on the hospitals and on the city and state budgets. A shortage of doctors and nurses is turning hospital emergency rooms into walk-in clinics, which increases the cost of these services. Many experts agree that federal policies on health care are in need of drastic changes.
Question now on this subject from Jim Sleeper.
Governor Clinton, AIDS that Dr. Fernandez referred to is the biggest killer of blacks and Hispanics in the New York and New Jersey area. But I suspect that is certainly not why so many celebrities have staked such a visible claim for AIDS research and treatment dollars. There are no celebrity benefits for mothers in the Bronx who don't get prenatal care. There are no celebrity benefits for people with TB, which is as contagious as AIDS, or for people who don't have any private doctors in their neighborhoods. The question I would ask you is, should the squeaky AIDS wheel be getting the grease before there's a universal and equal access to medical care?
Well, I believe that AIDS has reached almost epidemic proportions in many of our cities, including this one, and I think that is a false choice. People are dying of AIDS out there, and the cost of the AIDS problem should be borne as a part of a national health plan. My wife was the chairman of the board of the Children's Defense Fund for a long time. I believe in primary and preventive health care. I have said we can have no national health care program without it. I believe in reestablishing neighborhood clinics. I believe in education and preventive programs in the schools, but I also believe in dealing with AIDS. We shouldn't force ourselves to choose. We're wasting $100 billion a year today on outrageous insurance structures, health care bureaucracies, and government regulations unrelated to health care. Let's take that money and take care of AIDS and primary and preventive health care.
Governor Brown. Governor Brown.
Well, I think you make my point here. The concern about AIDS is because is because of a powerful concern on the part of people with some clout and who are articulate. And certainly we need the same kind of commitment to cure cancer, to cure the diseases of poor people. But that's the point. Unless you can mobilize the political will by challenging this corrupt status quo, this governing elite that doesn't get it, that thinks they can keep talking about issues while millions of people suffer, we're never going to get anywhere. I mean, the health lobbyists, the insurance companies, and the drug manufacturers, they're giving $30 million every 2 years to the Congress to keep it the way it is. We got to understand health as a right of every citizen from the day they're born, not as a commodity to be played with for profit. And if every other major country can do it, we can do it.
Follow up from Jim.
But Governor Brown, if your goal, for example, is to put more doctors in medically underserved neighborhoods, how can you do that without really taking on the medical establishment, and in what specific ways would you expect to have to do that, both in terms of not only in doctors' compensation, but control of equipment, the chasing of expensive equipment? How would you specifically tackle that, which is not so much a funding question as a priorities question?
Well, that's why I think you have to have I know you have to have a single payer system. You have to have a universal system so you can make priorities. And you don't submit yourself to the play of these different market forces that are distorting medical funding to over-specialization, which is over-treatment, over-medicalization, and underserving primary care. Now, if you have a single payer that then negotiates with medical providers, doctors and hospitals, you can then provide the incentives for underserved areas, and you can make that happen. Also, if you encourage people from all backgrounds to go to medical school, and you take off this terrible financial burden and allow people to go, not by borrowing money, but with scholarships, so they'll go out and serve their communities, you'll solve that problem.
Governor Clinton.
I believe, first of all, the key is, what do you cover in the national health plan? If you cover primary and preventive education, and you have funds set aside to establish neighborhood clinics, and you reestablish the National Health Service Corps, and you say you can pay for your medical education by going back home and working for 3 years in the neighborhood clinic, then we won't have only 15% of our doctors be family doctors. You can get the numbers up. No matter how you finance it, you've got to have a separate, clear system for funding clinics and for mandating the coverage of primary and preventive health care and for moving the doctors to the clinics through a National Health Service Corps. That's the way to get it done.
Question now for Governor Brown. Governor Brown, you talk about the single-payer system of medical insurance. You advocate, I know, the Canadian style of a universal health coverage where everyone is covered by a system paid for by taxes. But in Canada, the government regulates doctors' fees, and in several provinces, there is an effective earnings cap for doctors. Are you prepared to take on the American Medical Association and the medical profession and impose that kind of cap on doctors' salaries here in this country, and to limit also the competition among hospitals and clinics for the very latest equipment and technology?
I can't wait. Wait, I got another 20 seconds.
We'd like to hear why.
The reason why health care doesn't happen since the time Harry Truman called for it in 1949 is because of the power, not just of medical specialists, but of drug companies and insurance companies and all the rest. And like so many of these issues, there's an unreality even in talking about them if we don't acknowledge the extent of political battle needed, and the coalition and the insurgency and the organization and mobilization of moral force necessary to make even the next step. That's what this whole campaign is dedicated to create.
Governor Clinton.
I'd just like to point out that if you analyze this, as I've tried to do for over a year now, and talking to hundreds and hundreds of people, where's the real rip-off money? It's $60 billion in the way the insurance market's organized and the healthcare bureaucracy that it spawns. The doctor fees, we're spending too much on doctors because of overspecialization and overutilization. But the average doctor in single practice spends 30% of income on paperwork. The drug companies are charging 3 times the rate of inflation because there are no restraints there. So you can still let the doctors earn a comfortable living if you organize this system, take the waste out of it, get away from the fee-for-service aspect and the overutilization. Doctors will still do quite fine, and most doctors will support it just to get the government and the insurance companies and the bureaucracy out of their hair.
Governor Brown, in a very short time, how can you say that your flat tax would not only pay the government's expenses but also cover your health care proposal costs? How does that work?
You're going to have to phase it in. You're going to have to curb the $80 billion increase every year. You take that for a couple of years, and you have a whole national health care financed. And also, you save all the money that you're now paying in premiums. You're now paying on Medicare, Medicaid, the Veterans Affairs, and the $50 billion of tax exemption for employer health plans and for the tax deductions that people get for buying health care themselves. That's a tremendous amount of revenue that you're no longer going to have to spend, and you put that into the pot, as it were. And to the extent that you need more money, then you have to add to the tax. And we understand that. And the point is, people have to make that choice. If they want a universal health care system that's efficient, that will allow all of us to be healthy, we're going to have to pay for it. And Governor I've never said that it's not going to cost a few more pennies.
Thank you, sir. Governor Clinton.
The problem is with a 13% flat tax and a 13% national value-added tax, which is a sales tax business will pass on to people like they do in every country. They pass the value-added tax on. According to the Citizens for Tax Justice and the press that's analyzed it, you're going to increase taxes on the working poor with the two taxes together. You're going to increase taxes on the middle class. You're going to have, yet again, lower taxes on the wealthy. I'd get a tax cut out of it, and people that really make money in the 80s, they're going to get a killing out of it. It removes the deductibility for state and local income taxes, costs New York $4 billion, ends the Social Security Trust Fund, putting those funds into the budget with other things, runs a $180 billion extra deficit. So you have to go to 16 and 16 to get as much money as you're raising now. And if you replace the $500 billion in health insurance, that's another 8 and 8, or 24 and 24. If the people want it, they can have
Governor
it,
Clinton.
but it's a ripoff.
Thank you, Governor Clinton.
I got to just say,
and Governor Brown.
Wait a minute.
Governor Brown, we have to go. That ends our question and answer.
Say, if that were true, I'd be concerned true. I'd be concerned
Governor,
also, but
Governor
it's not
Brown,
true.
Governor Brown, there will be closing statements for this.
Is a tax on business,
we will have closing,
not on poor people.
Governor Brown, you'll have your opportunity. That ends our questions and answers at the moment, though. The candidates will now have 2 minutes each for their closing statements, and by a toss of the coin, we begin with Governor Clinton.
I want to say, first of all, how much I appreciate Lehman College of New York and all the rest of you, and the Bronx Borough President for sponsoring this opportunity for us to discuss the issues. I think the American people desperately want change. They know we're in economic decline. They know our country's coming apart at the seams when it ought to be coming together. They surely know we've seen an absence of political leadership. I believe there are political problems in Washington in both parties. I believe special interests have had too much influence. But the real problem is we have not had a president who would take responsibility for the future of this country and give us real change. We don't want George Bush. That's no change. But we can't afford the wrong change. We've got to have change which restores our economic leadership with a real national policy for new jobs here, for education, for health care, for the environment, for energy. We also have got to pull this country back together again. We've got to liberate people from their dependencies. We've got to save these kids that are being shot in our schools. We've got to recognize that we're all one country. Somehow the president has got to reach out and touch people without regard to race, or ethnic group, or region, or income, and say, listen, we have been divided too long. We've got to pull together. We've got to work together. We've got to take advantage of the end of the Cold War to create the kind of America we ought to have. It can be done, but we've got to have the courage to have fundamental change and to stop ignoring all the things that other countries that want to be high-skilled, high-growth, high-opportunity countries are doing. If you will give me the chance to serve, I'll give you the kind of change this country needs. I've worked hard during the 1980s to create jobs, to educate children, to pull people together. I know we can do better. The purpose of politics is to enable every person in this country to live up to his or her God-given abilities. We're a long way from that now because of national neglect. Let's make America compete and win again. Let's prove we can be one nation again. Thank you very much.
Governor Brown.
We're facing a crisis in this country. It's been building not for 10 years, it's been building for 25 years. Human beings are living in degradation. Our economy is not as competitive as it must be. We're turning the planet into a stinking junkyard. And all for short-term gain, and it's unnecessary. The Cold War is over. This ought to be a period of renaissance, revitalization in the cities and the rest of the suburbs and the areas of this country. And what's happening is we got a stuck status quo. They know how to bail out the S&L business, which they themselves helped create. They know how to raise their salaries in the middle of the night. They know how to bounce checks. They know how to spend $150 billion more than we need on the military defense of Japan and Korea and Europe and all the rest of these countries, but they don't have the political will to come back home and invest in the kind of America that our Constitution guarantees every one of us. And that's the right to life, and to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a moral imperative to make sure that every child grows up in a context of a living family wage. It's not a problem of getting the list. We know how to create national health care. We know how to create energy efficiency. We know how to create urban improvement in infrastructure and high-speed trains and transit and all the rest. What we don't and what we haven't had is the willingness to challenge a corrupt status quo that depends on $1,000 donations, that depends on the power of the few to manipulate the rest of us. The whole basis of my campaign, it's not about me, it's not about Mr. Clinton. It is about a coalition of Americans taking back their country. And I want to just thank all those who have made it possible for me to even be in this debate next to what has been the front runner. And I want to say, folks, thank you very much. Call our number. Keep it going. 1-800-426-1112. That's 426-1112.
And that,
you make it possible for me to stay here. Thank you very much.
That has to be the most well-known 800 number in the country. But we thank Governor Clinton and Governor Brown now, and we go to our sponsors for their last word. Borough President Ferrer.
Well, that's our debate on urban issues, and we'd like to thank Governor Clinton and former Governor Brown for coming to the Bronx not to achieve a photo opportunity, but for coming to Lehman College and the Borough of Universities to discuss these issues with all of us. And we'd like to thank our panelists, Sam Roberts, Roz Abrams, Jim Sleeper, and Bill Butel, for asking the tough questions in this debate for urban America.
And thank you very much, Borough President Fernando Ferrer, for being with us this evening. And thank all of you for joining us. Tonight, we have given the candidates an opportunity to address issues that are of special interest to urban areas. They've had their say. The New York primary is 1 week from today, and that's when you have your say. I'm Bill Butel for all of us. Thanks very much, and good night.
C-SPAN, the cable satellite public affairs network, and its companion network, C-SPAN 2, are privately funded to serve the public by America's cable television companies.
Here's a look at the overnight program schedule. Please note, all listed times are Eastern. Coming next, we take you up to Capitol Hill for coverage of a congressional hearing on perks and privileges for the executive branch officials and White House staff. After that, we bring you a conference sponsored today by Women in Government Relations. You will see a speech by Senator Robert Dole, the minority leader, and then a panel discussion featuring the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Leon Panetta. This evening at about 11:20 p.m., we'll re-air the Democratic presidential candidates debate from the Bronx, New York, that you just saw live here on C-SPAN. After that, members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee discuss U.S.-Vietnamese relations. Just past 2:30 in the morning, members of a House Administration Subcommittee again look into the issue of special